August 7, 1942, the pre-dawn darkness over the Solomon Islands is about to be shattered. Thousands of young Marines are crammed into landing craft, their knuckles white as they grip their rifles. Many have never seen combat. None of them know they about to step into 6 months of absolute hell. A nightmare of jungle warfare, starvation, disease, and some of the most savage naval battles ever fought. This is Guadalcanal, and what happens here will determine who controls the Pacific for the rest of World War II. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most brutal and pivotal campaigns of World War II, the Battle of Guadalcanal. This wasn't just another island battle. This was the moment when America stopped retreating and started fighting back. The moment when Japan's unstoppable advance ground to a bloody halt. And it all happened on a mosquito-infested island that most Americans had never even heard of. By the time you finish this video, you'll understand why military historians call Guadalcanal the turning point of the Pacific War, and why the men who fought there simply called it hell. Let's set the stage. It's early 1942, and the Empire of Japan is on a rampage. 6 months earlier, on December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft devastated Pearl Harbor, crippling much of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Almost 2,500 Americans died that day, and America's battleship fleet lay shattered at the bottom of the harbor. But Pearl Harbor was just the beginning. In the months that followed, Japan seemed unstoppable. They swept through Southeast Asia like a tsunami. Wake Island fell, Guam fell. The Philippines fell after a heroic but doomed defense. Singapore, Britain's supposedly impregnable fortress, surrendered in what Winston Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. Burma, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, one by one, they fell into Japanese hands. Japan's strategy was crystal clear: create a defensive perimeter so vast, so intimidating, that the United States would sue for peace rather than pay the blood price to take it back. And for a while, it looked like they might actually pull it off. But then something changed. In May 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea ended in a draw, but it was the first time Japan's advance had been checked. Then came June and the Battle of Midway, the stunning American victory that destroyed 4 Japanese carriers and killed hundreds of their most experienced pilots. Naval parity was established, but Japan still controlled the initiative. The problem was New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. If Japan secured these areas, they could cut off Australia and New Zealand from the United States. They could threaten America's supply lines across the entire South Pacific. And they were already building an airfield on a godforsaken island called Guadalcanal. That would give them complete air superiority over the region. The United States had to act, and fast. On August 7, 1942, Operation Watchtower began. It was America's first major offensive operation of the war, and honestly, it was thrown together with spit and prayers. The Marines who participated called it Operation Shoestring because they were launching with inadequate supplies, outdated equipment, and incomplete intelligence. Some of the Marines were still carrying World War I-era rifles. Major General Alexander Vandegrift commanded the 1st Marine Division, about 11,000 men, who were about to write themselves into history. At 9:10 a.m., after naval bombardment and airstrikes, the 1st Marines hit the beaches at Guadalcanal and nearby Tulagi. The Japanese were caught completely by surprise. The airfield construction crews on Guadalcanal, they weren't combat troops, just laborers and engineers, took one look at the American Armada offshore and ran into the jungle. By nightfall, the Marines had captured the nearly complete airfield without firing a shot. They renamed it Henderson Field after a Marine pilot killed at Midway. But on Tulagi and the tiny islands of Gavutu and Tanobogo, it was a different story. There, the Marines faced elite Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces, Japan's version of Marines. These men fought with fanatical determination, turning every pillbox and bunker into a death trap. The Japanese garrison was virtually annihilated to the last man. It was a grim preview of what was coming. The Marines might have secured the beaches easily, but in the waters around Guadalcanal, catastrophe was about to strike. 2 days after the landings, in the early morning darkness of August 9th, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa executed one of the most devastating surprise attacks in naval history. The Battle of Savo Island lasted just 37 minutes, but in that time, the Imperial Japanese Navy destroyed 4 Allied heavy cruisers and killed over 1,000 American and Australian sailors. The USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and HMAS Canberra all sunk or fatally damaged in a single night. The Japanese didn't lose a single ship. It was the U.S. Navy's worst defeat at sea. And it happened despite the fact that the Allies had radar and should have detected the Japanese force approaching. How did it happen? Intelligence failures. Communication breakdowns. Underestimating the Japanese. And the Japanese excellence at night fighting they had trained for years to master the art of surprise in darkness. And at Savo Island it paid off devastatingly. But here's the thing, Admiral Mikawa made a critical mistake. After destroying the Allied cruisers, he could have pressed on and annihilated the vulnerable transport ships that were still unloading supplies for the Marines. Instead, fearing American air attack at dawn, he withdrew. That decision probably saved the Guadalcanal campaign, but it also meant the Marines were now stranded. The supporting fleet pulled out, taking with them much of the supplies that hadn't been unloaded yet. The Marines were on their own, holding Henderson Field with limited food, ammunition, and no guarantee that help was coming. Henderson Field became the focal point of everything that happened on Guadalcanal. Whoever controlled that airstrip controlled the skies over the Solomon Islands. And whoever controlled the skies controlled who could supply their forces. The Cactus Air Force, named after the Allied code name for Guadalcanal, operated from Henderson Field with a ragtag collection of Marine F-4F Wildcats, Navy dive bombers, and Army P-39S and P-40s. They were constantly outnumbered by the Japanese Zeros flying down from Rabaul, but they had 2 advantages. They were defending the airfield, so damaged planes could land and be repaired, and the Zeros, flying at their maximum range, couldn't stay long to dogfight. The airfield changed everything. During daylight hours, any Japanese ship that came within 200 miles of Guadalcanal was in danger of being bombed. This meant the Japanese couldn't use slow, heavily laden transport ships to supply their forces. Their solution? The Tokyo Express. The Americans called it the Tokyo Express. The Japanese called it rat transportation. Either way, it was one of the most audacious supply operations of the war. Unable to risk slow transports during the day, the Japanese loaded troops and supplies onto fast destroyers and cruisers. These warships would race down the slot, new Georgia Sound under cover of darkness, drop off men and materials, and race back before dawn exposed them to American air attack. The Tokyo Express ran like clockwork night after night, delivering thousands of Japanese reinforcements to Guadalcanal. But there was a fatal flaw. Destroyers weren't designed for cargo. They couldn't carry heavy artillery, vehicles, or large quantities of food and ammunition. Supplies were often loaded into steel drums and simply pushed overboard near the beach with the hope they'd float ashore. Many didn't. In one typical night, 1,500 drums were pushed into the sea and only 300 were recovered. The Tokyo Express also tied up destroyers that Japan desperately needed elsewhere, particularly to escort merchant shipping that was increasingly under attack from American submarines. It was a losing proposition, but Japan had no choice. The airfield made everything else impossible. While ships fought for control of the seas around Guadalcanal, on land the Marines were fighting for their lives in conditions that defied imagination. The first Japanese ground assault came on August 21st at a place the Marines called Alligator Creek. Though it's often mistakenly called the Battle of the Sinaru River on U.S. maps, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki led about 900 troops in a nighttime frontal assault against Marine positions. Ichiki had grotesquely underestimated American strength. His men charged straight into concentrated machine gun and artillery fire. It was slaughter. By dawn, Ichiki's force was virtually annihilated. The colonel himself, seeing his defeat, burned his regimental colors and committed suicide. Of his 900 men, only a handful survived. But the Japanese weren't done. Not by a long shot. In mid-September, Major General Kyote Kawaguchi landed with over 6,000 troops. His plan was to attack Henderson Field from multiple directions simultaneously. The main assault would come through a jungle-covered ridge just south of the airfield, a ridge held by 840 Marines under Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson. The Battle of Edson's Ridge, fought on September 12th to 14th, was desperate hand-to-hand combat in the darkness. Wave after wave of Japanese infantry charged up the ridge, screaming, "Marines, you die!" The Marines, firing until their machine gun barrels glowed red-hot, held on by their fingernails. At one point, the Japanese broke through the first line of defense. The situation was so critical that Marine artillerymen called in fire missions on their own positions. Colonel Edson, walking calmly along the line as bullets whizzed past, rallied his men with the words that became legend. "The only thing they've got that you haven't is guts. Are you going to let them push you around?" The Marines held. But just barely. When dawn came, the ridge was littered with Japanese bodies sprawled in the pitiful and repulsive attitudes of death, as one Marine described it. Over 800 Japanese soldiers were dead. The Marines had lost 40 killed and 103 wounded, but they'd saved Henderson Field by October. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, commander of Japan's 17th Army, had arrived on Guadalcanal personally to oversee what he was certain would be the final, victorious offensive. He had over 20,000 troops, heavy artillery including 100mm cannons and 150mm howitzers, and absolute confidence. "The time of the decisive battle between Japan and the United States has come," Hyakutake declared. He was so certain of victory that he ordered his staff to begin preparing the surrender ceremony for the Americans. It would be, he insisted, the most impressive surrender ceremony in the history of the Japanese Army. The offensive began on the night of October 23rd with the heaviest artillery bombardment the Marines had yet experienced. "It looks like this is the night," one Marine officer muttered as the sky lit up with explosions. The Japanese 29th Infantry Regiment smashed into Marine positions held by Colonel Louis Chesty Puller's battalion. What followed was 3 days of unrelenting combat. The Japanese attacked with their characteristic determination, charging again and again into withering fire. Marine Gunnery Sergeant John Bassellone became legendary that night. With machine guns burning out from constant firing, his men literally urinated into the water jackets to cool them down. When guns ran out of ammunition, Bassellone ran through Japanese fire to bring more. When other gun crews were killed, he manned the weapons himself. He would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions. The Japanese threw everything they had at Henderson Field, but the Marines held. Every attack was repulsed with staggering Japanese casualties. After 3 days of brutal combat, Hyakutake called off the offensive. His army had been shattered. Instead of accepting the American surrender, he was now fighting for survival. When Marines interrogated a Japanese prisoner after the battle, they asked him a simple question: "Why didn't you change tactics when you saw you were unbreaking our line? Why didn't you shift to a weaker spot?" The prisoner's response was chilling in its honesty. "That is not the Japanese way." The plan had been made. Japan made one final, desperate attempt to knock out Henderson Field and pour in enough reinforcements to overwhelm the American defenders. In mid-November, Admiral Yamamoto assembled a massive naval force, 11 transport ships carrying 7,000 troops and their equipment, escorted by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The plan was to bombard Henderson Field into rubble, then land the troops and retake the island. What followed from November 12th to 15th was the naval battle of Guadalcanal, one of the most chaotic, brutal, and decisive sea battles of the entire war. The first night, November 12th to 13th, American and Japanese warships clashed in the darkness at point-blank range. There was no time for sophisticated tactics. Ships passed so close that sailors on deck could see each other's faces. The battleship USS South Dakota and the Japanese battleship Kirishima traded salvos at ranges measured in hundreds of yards, not miles. 2 American admirals, Daniel Callahan and Norman Scott, were killed in the fighting, the only U.S. Navy admirals to die in surface combat during the war. But the Americans accomplished their mission. They prevented the Japanese from bombarding Henderson Field and forced them to withdraw. The next morning, American aircraft from Henderson Field caught the Japanese transport convoy in daylight. It was a turkey shoot. Dive bombers screamed down on the slow, vulnerable transports. One by one, they were hit, burning and sinking. The destroyer USS Meade joined in, shelling the beach transports that had tried to run themselves aground. Of the 11 transports, only 4 made it to Guadalcanal, and they were destroyed while unloading. Of the 7,000 troops embarked, only 2,000 made it ashore, and most of their food and ammunition was lost. The naval battle of Guadalcanal was the turning point. Japan had thrown everything they had at recapturing Henderson Field and failed. President Franklin Roosevelt, upon hearing the results, remarked, "It would seem that the turning point in this war has at last been reached." After November, the outcome was no longer in doubt, but that didn't make it any easier for the men on both sides. For the Japanese soldiers still on Guadalcanal, conditions deteriorated into nightmare. The Tokyo Express could no longer deliver adequate supplies. Food ran out, then medicine ran out. Tropical diseases, malaria, dysentery, beriberi ravaged the Japanese forces. Men became walking skeletons, too weak to fight, often too weak even to walk. By December 1942, the Japanese were losing 50 men per day, not to combat, but to starvation and disease. Of the roughly 36,000 Japanese troops who fought on Guadalcanal, about 31,000 would die. 3/4 of those deaths were from non-combat causes. The men who survived called it Starvation Island. The Americans weren't having a picnic either. Malaria infected thousands of Marines and soldiers. Dysentery was rampant. The intense heat, constant rain, and stress of combat took their toll. By late 1942, the 1st Marine Division was physically and mentally exhausted, having been in continuous combat for 4 months. They were finally relieved by Army units under Major General Alexander Patch in December and January. On December 31, 1942, Emperor Hirohito himself authorized the withdrawal from Guadalcanal. It was the first time Japan had abandoned a major objective in the war. Operation Ke, the evacuation, was executed with remarkable skill between February 1st to 7th, 1943. Using the Tokyo Express one final time, Japanese destroyers evacuated about 13,000 troops from Cape Esperance, under cover of darkness and a brilliant deception campaign. The Americans, thinking the Japanese were reinforcing for another offensive, were caught completely off guard. On February 9, 1943, General Patch sent a simple message to Admiral William Halsey. Tokyo Express no longer has terminus on Guadalcanal. The campaign was over. The numbers are staggering. The Allies lost approximately 7,100 men, 29 ships, and 615 aircraft. The Japanese lost 31,000 men, 38 ships, and 683 aircraft. The waters around Guadalcanal became so littered with sunken ships that sailors called it Iron Bottom Sound, a name it bears to this day. But the true cost can't be measured just in numbers. For the young men who fought there, Guadalcanal was a crucible that tested everything they had. Marines who landed fresh-faced in August were hollow-eyed veterans by the time they left. The jungle, the diseases, the constant threat of death from shell, bullet, or bomb, it aged men decades in a matter of months. And yet they won. Against all odds, under terrible conditions, with inadequate supplies and facing a determined enemy who refused to surrender, they won. Guadalcanal, along with the victory at Midway, marked the turning point in the Pacific War. Before Guadalcanal, Japan was on the offensive, expanding its empire. After Guadalcanal, Japan was on the defensive, fighting to hold what it had already taken. The strategic initiative had passed permanently to the Allies. The campaign also taught the American military crucial lessons about combined arms warfare. The Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and Army Air Forces learned to work together, coordinating ground, air, and naval operations in ways that would define the rest of the Pacific campaign. The mistakes made at Guadalcanal, and there were many, wouldn't be repeated at Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, or Okinawa. Henderson Field, the prize that cost so much blood to capture and defend, became the springboard for the Allied advance up the Solomon Islands. From there, American forces would leapfrog north, isolating Japanese strongholds, cutting their supply lines and pushing steadily toward the Japanese home islands. Today, the island of Guadalcanal is peaceful. The jungle has reclaimed the battlefields. Henderson Field is now Honiara International Airport, But beneath the waters of Ironbottom Sound, dozens of ships still lie where they sank over 80 years ago, silent monuments to the men who fought and died there. The veterans of Guadalcanal, the ones who survived, carried the memory of those 6 months for the rest of their lives. They remembered the heat, the mud, the fear. They remembered their friends who never made it home. They remembered the night battles when the darkness exploded with gunfire and the jungle came alive with screaming enemies. They remembered going days without proper food, weeks without a shower, months without seeing their families. But they also remembered that they won. When their nation needed them, when the outcome of the war hung in the balance, they stood and fought. They held that airfield. They stopped the Japanese advance. They turned the tide of the Pacific War. Guadalcanal wasn't the biggest battle of World War II. It wasn't the bloodiest. But it might have been the most important. It was the moment when America's industrial might and fighting spirit began to overwhelm Japan's early advantages. It was where raw recruits became hardened veterans, where tactical lessons were learned in blood, where the myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered forever. The men who fought at Guadalcanal were ordinary Americans, farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college kids from California. They didn't start the war. They didn't want to be there. But when they were called, they went. And they fought with a determination and courage that still echoes through history. So the next time you hear the name Guadalcanal, remember what it really represents. 6 months of hell on a tropical island. A battle fought in the air, on the sea, and on land simultaneously. A campaign that cost tens of thousands of lives. And most importantly, the moment when the tide of World War II in the Pacific began to turn. That's all for today's documentary. If you found this video informative, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more World War II content. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts or if you have a topic you'd like us to cover next. And as always, let's never forget the sacrifice of those who fought for our freedom. Until next time, this has been a look at one of history's most pivotal battles. Thank you for watching.